I never thought a 150-year-old barn would be the thing that saved my entire life from being controlled by a power-hungry woman with too much time on her hands. But here we are. My name is Henry Morrison, and I bought a property in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania about 3 years ago. The place was a dream: 7 acres of rolling hills, a modest 2-story farmhouse that needed some work, and an ancient barn that looked like it had seen better days but still stood proud against the Pennsylvania sky. The barn was the reason I fell in love with the property. It had weathered wood planks, a stone foundation that looked older than the Civil War, and these massive hand-hewn beams inside that you just don't see anymore. The real estate agent told me it came with the property, built sometime in the 1870s by German immigrants who settled the area. I didn't care that it leaned slightly to the left or that some of the boards were rotting. It had character, history, and it was mine. The neighborhood was part of a development that had grown up around these old farms over the past 20 years. New construction houses with perfectly manicured lawns surrounded my property on 3 sides, all part of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. When I bought the place, I knew I'd be joining the HOA, but the previous owner assured me they were reasonable people who just wanted to keep property values up. He'd lived there for 40 years before the HOA even existed, so he was grandfathered in on most of their rules. I figured I'd be fine. I was wrong. 3 months after I moved in, I got my first letter from the HOA. It was professionally printed on cream-colored cardstock, with the Meadowbrook Estates logo at the top, a pretentious little illustration of a house with a white picket fence. The letter informed me that my barn was not in compliance with community standards and that I needed to submit a plan for renovation or removal within 30 days. It was signed by Patricia Whitmore, HOA president. I crumpled up the letter and threw it in the recycling bin. The barn was on my property, set back almost 200 feet from the road. You could barely see it from the street because of the old oak trees that lined my driveway. I figured Patricia was just flexing her authority, and if I ignored it, she'd move on to bothering someone else about their mailbox color or something. 2 weeks later, I got a second letter. This one was more aggressive. It stated that failure to comply with HOA regulations would result in daily fines of $50, and that the HOA board had voted unanimously to require the barn's removal due to its unsightly appearance and negative impact on neighboring property values. I was given another 2 weeks to respond. That's when I decided I needed to actually read through my HOA agreement. I spent an entire Saturday afternoon going through the thick packet of documents I'd signed at closing, looking for anything about barns or outbuildings. What I found was vague language about maintaining structures in good repair and keeping properties aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards. There was nothing specific about barns, nothing about historical structures, and definitely nothing that gave them the right to demand I tear down a building that was older than their entire subdivision. I drafted a response letter explaining that the barn was a historical structure that predated the HOA by more than a century, that it was on my private property and not visible from most of the neighborhood, and that I had no intention of removing it. I did agree to make some repairs to improve its appearance, though I was already planning to do that anyway. I sent the letter via certified mail so there'd be a record. The response came faster than I expected. 3 days later, I had another letter from Patricia, along with a notice that I was required to attend the next HOA board meeting to discuss the matter. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 in the evening at the community center. I showed up 15 minutes early, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, carrying a folder with photos of the barn and printouts of the property deed showing the barn's existence dating back to at least 1875. The community center was a small building near the neighborhood entrance, with a meeting room that held about 30 people. When I walked in, there were already a dozen residents sitting in folding chairs, and 5 board members sat at a long table at the front of the room. Patricia Whitmore was exactly what I expected. She was probably in her mid-50s with short blonde hair styled in that specific way that required weekly salon visits, and she wore a navy blazer over a white blouse. She had that look in her eyes that I'd seen before, the look of someone who had found their purpose in life by controlling other people's choices. Next to her sat 4 other board members who all looked vaguely uncomfortable, like they knew this meeting was going to be a disaster but were too polite to say anything. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia said when she saw me, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "So glad you could join us. Please, have a seat." We'll get to your issues shortly. I sat in the front row and waited while they went through other business, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing the budget for new landscaping at the entrance, debating whether to allow Christmas decorations before Thanksgiving. Finally, after 30 minutes of mind-numbing bureaucracy, Patricia cleared her throat and looked directly at me. "Now, let's discuss the Morrison property and the barn situation," she announced, like she was introducing a major scandal. "Mr. Morrison, you've received multiple notices regarding the unacceptable condition of the barn structure on your property. The board has determined that this structure is detrimental to property values and must be removed. We're here tonight to discuss your compliance plan." I stood up, folder in hand. "With all due respect, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not removing the barn. It's a historical structure that was built in 1875, long before this neighborhood existed. It's on my private property, and I have every right to maintain it." Patricia's smile didn't waver, but her eyes got harder. "Mr. Morrison, when you purchased your property, you agreed to abide by HOA regulations. Those regulations give the authority to maintain community standards. Your barn is an eyesore, and multiple neighbors have complained." "Which neighbors?" I asked, looking around the room. Nobody made eye contact. "Because I've talked to the Hendersons next door, and the Chens across the street, and they both said they love the barn. They think it adds character to the neighborhood." One of the other board members, an older man whose nameplate read Robert Chen, nodded slightly. I realized he must be related to my neighbors. Patricia ignored my question. "The complaints are on record. The board has voted, and the decision is final. You have 60 days to remove the structure, or we'll begin assessing daily fines of $100. If the fines remain unpaid, we have the legal right to place a lien on your property." The room went quiet. I felt my face getting hot, but I kept my voice steady. "You can't force me to demolish a building that's older than your organization. I'm going to fight this." "That's your right," Patricia said, still smiling that awful smile. "But I should warn you that legal battles with the HOA rarely end well for individual homeowners. We have significant legal resources at our disposal, funded by all the residents' dues. Do you really want to drain your savings fighting us?" It was a threat, plain and simple. I looked at the other board members, hoping to see some sign of disagreement, but they all avoided my eyes except for Robert Chen, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "I'll see you in court," I said, and walked out. Over the next week, I did what any rational person would do in the 21st century. I went down a research rabbit hole. I spent hours online looking up HOA laws in Pennsylvania, property rights, historical preservation statutes, everything I could find. I learned that Pennsylvania has some protections for historical structures, but they mostly apply to properties that are officially registered as historical landmarks. I also found horror stories from people around the country who'd been bankrupted fighting their HOAs, lost their homes to liens, or just given up and moved away. But I also found something interesting. Pennsylvania has a state registry for historical properties, maintained by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Properties can be nominated for the registry if they're at least 50 years old and meet certain criteria for historical or architectural significance. Once registered, they receive certain protections under state law, including exemptions from local regulations that would require their alteration or demolition. The barn was definitely old enough. The question was whether it would qualify as historically significant. I needed to do more research on the property's history and the barn's construction. I started at the Lancaster County Historical Society, which had records going back to the 1700s. A helpful librarian named Margaret showed me how to search through property records, old maps, and historical documents. After 3 visits and countless hours poring over faded documents, I pieced together the story. The property had originally been part of a larger farm owned by a German immigrant family named Weber. Johann Weber had come to Pennsylvania in 1848, bought 120 acres, and built a farmhouse and barn using traditional German timber frame construction methods. The barn I owned was that original barn built in 1873 according to a property assessment record I found from 1875. The construction technique was called Pennsylvania German bank barn style, where the barn is built into a hillside, so you can access both the lower level and the upper level from ground level on different sides. These barns were distinctive to German immigrant communities in Pennsylvania and were considered architecturally significant examples of ethnic building traditions. Even better, Johann Weber had apparently been a notable figure in the local community. I found newspaper clippings from the 1880s mentioning his participation in the local German-American Cultural Society, and his farm had been used as a gathering place for the German immigrant community during the late 19th century. The barn itself had hosted harvest festivals, community meetings, and even served as a temporary school during the winter of 1879 when the local schoolhouse burned down. This was exactly what I needed. The barn wasn't just old, it had genuine historical and cultural significance. I made copies of everything I'd found and started preparing a nomination form for the Pennsylvania Registry of Historical Places. Meanwhile, the HOA wasn't sitting idle. I received a certified letter informing me that I was now being fined $100 per day for non-compliance, starting immediately. The letter also informed me that I was prohibited from making any repairs or alterations to the barn without prior HOA approval, because any work would be considered investment in a non-compliant structure. It was a catch-22. They wanted the barn gone, but they wouldn't let me fix it up to meet their standards. I called a lawyer, a woman named Susan Rodriguez, who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. She agreed to meet with me for a consultation. Susan's office was in downtown Lancaster, in one of those renovated old buildings with exposed brick and hardwood floors. She was probably in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a bun, and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd been in too many courtroom battles to have patience for games. HOA cases are tricky, she told me after I'd explained the situation. Legally, they do have a lot of power. When you bought the property, you signed a contract agreeing to abide by their rules. The question is whether their rules are reasonable and whether they're being applied fairly. They're trying to make me demolish a historical barn that's been there for 150 years, I said. How is that reasonable? I agree with you, but we need to prove it in court. The good news is that you have some strong arguments. The barn predates the HOA, it has apparent historical value, and their rules are vague enough that we can argue they're being interpreted unfairly. The bad news is that this kind of litigation is expensive and can take years. How expensive are we talking? If we go to trial, probably $30,000 to $50,000 in legal fees. Maybe more if they really fight us. I felt sick. I didn't have that kind of money sitting around. What if I can get the barn registered as a historical landmark? Would that help? Susan's eyes lit up. That would change everything. If the barn is on the state registry, it's protected under Pennsylvania's history code. The HOA's rules would be superseded by state law. They couldn't force you to demolish it. I'm working on the nomination now. I've found documentation going back to 1873, and the barn has historical significance beyond just being old. That's excellent. Submit the nomination as soon as possible, and in the meantime, let me draft a response to the HOA. We'll argue that the barn is potentially eligible for historical registry, and that demolishing it would violate state preservation laws. That should buy us some time and might make them back off. I left her office feeling slightly more hopeful, but also overwhelmed. The fines were adding up already, $3,600 after 36 days, and I had no idea how long the historical registry process would take. I spent the next 2 weeks finishing the nomination application. It was a thick packet of forms, photographs, historical documentation, and written narrative explaining the barn's significance. I included everything I'd found at the Historical Society, plus photos showing the traditional timber frame construction, the original hand-forged hardware, and the stone foundation. I even hired a professional photographer to take high-quality images that showed the barn's architectural details. I submitted the application to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission on a Friday afternoon, along with the required filing fee of $200. The clerk who accepted my submission told me it would probably take 4 to 6 months for the commission to review the application and make a decision. 6 months. In 6 months, my fines would be over $18,000. Susan sent a letter to the HOA explaining that I'd submitted a historical registry nomination and requesting that they suspend the fines pending the outcome. I didn't expect them to agree, but it was worth trying. Patricia's response came within 3 days. The letter was 2 pages of dense legal language, but the message was clear. The HOA rejected our request, the fines would continue, and if I didn't pay the accumulated fines within 30 days, they would place a lien on my property. Furthermore, the letter stated that the HOA board had consulted with their attorney and determined that even if the barn was granted historical status, the HOA's authority to maintain community standards would still supersede state preservation laws, because I had contractually agreed to their rules when I purchased the property. That's complete nonsense, Susan told me when I forwarded her the letter. They're bluffing. State law absolutely supersedes private HOA rules when it comes to registered historical properties. But the problem is that the barn isn't registered yet, so technically they're within their rights to assess fines under the current HOA agreement. So what do? We file for an injunction. We go to court and ask a judge to temporarily halt the fines and prevent the HOA from placing a lien on your property until the historical registry decision is made. It's not guaranteed to work, but we have a decent argument that the fines are excessive and that you're making a good faith effort to preserve a potentially historical structure. How much will that cost? I can file the injunction for about $5,000. If they fight it and we end up in hearings, maybe another $5,000 to $10,000. I didn't have much choice. I agreed, and Susan got to work on the filing. While the legal process ground forward, life went on. I still had to go to work every day. I was a project manager for a commercial construction company, which meant long hours and constant stress even without the HOA drama. My boss had noticed I was distracted, and I'd had to explain the situation to him. Thankfully, he was sympathetic. He dealt with an HOA at his previous house and hated them with a passion. Those people are petty tyrants, he told me over lunch one day. They get a tiny bit of power and it goes straight to their heads. But here's my advice: don't let them see you sweat. The more you show them it's getting to you, the more they'll push. People like that feed on making others miserable. He was right, but it was hard advice to follow. Every time I pulled into my driveway and saw the barn, I felt a mixture of love and stress. I'd started making small repairs on weekends, replacing a few boards here and there, reinforcing the structure where I could. I figured if the barn was going to be registered as historical, it should at least look like I was taking care of it. One Saturday morning in late June, I was working on the barn when I heard a car pull up. I climbed down from the ladder I'd been using to access the upper level and saw Patricia Whitmore getting out of a silver Lexus SUV. She was wearing white capri pants and a floral blouse, completely inappropriate for walking around a farm property, and she had her phone out taking pictures. "Can I help you?" I called out, wiping sawdust off my hands. She lowered her phone and gave me that same fake smile. "Mr. Morrison, I'm just documenting the current state of the property for HOA records. I see you're doing work on the barn, basic maintenance and repairs. Nothing that requires HOA approval. Actually, according to our bylaws, any exterior work on structures visible from neighboring properties requires Architectural Review Board approval. You didn't submit an application." I felt my jaw clench. "The barn was here before your Architectural Review Board existed. I don't need permission to maintain my own property." "That's not what our attorney says. I'll need to add this to your file. Unauthorized construction work will result in additional fines." She went back to taking pictures, walking around the barn and shooting photos from every angle. "You're on my private property without permission," I said, my voice louder than I intended. "I need you to leave now." Patricia looked at me with mock concern. "Mr. Morrison, there's no need to be hostile. I'm simply doing my duty as HOA president. But if you'd like me to leave, I'll certainly respect your wishes. However, I should inform you that the board is meeting next week to discuss whether your continued violations warrant legal action beyond just fines. We're considering seeking a court order to compel demolition of the barn." My heart started pounding. "You can't do that." "We can, actually, and we will if you don't comply voluntarily. Have a nice day, Mr. Morrison." She walked back to her car, got in, and drove away, leaving me standing there feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. That evening, I called Susan and told her what had happened. She was furious. "She came onto your property without permission and threatened you. That's harassment, Henry. We can use this." "How?" "I'm going to add it to the injunction filing. We'll argue that the HOA is acting in bad faith, that they're engaging in targeted harassment, and that their threat to seek a court-ordered demolition is retaliatory. Judges don't like bullies, and that's exactly what she is." The injunction hearing was scheduled for mid-July, about 3 weeks away. In the meantime, Susan advised me not to engage with Patricia or any other HOA board members, to document everything, and to keep making my case to the Historical Commission. I took her advice seriously. I stopped responding to HOA letters except through Susan. I installed a security camera system around my property, partly for documentation and partly because I didn't trust Patricia not to do something crazy. And I reached out to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission to check on the status of my application. The woman I spoke with at the commission was sympathetic but not encouraging. "We've received your application, Mr. Morrison, and it's in the queue for review. Unfortunately, we're quite backlogged right now. It could be 8 to 12 months before we make a determination. Is there any way to expedite it? I'm facing legal action that could result in the barn being demolished before you even review the application. Let me see what I can do. If you can provide documentation of the legal threat, I can flag your application as urgent and see if we can move it up in the queue." No promises, though. I sent her copies of all the HOA letters and Susan's legal filings. 3 days later, she called me back. "Good news, Mr. Morrison. I spoke with my supervisor, and we've agreed to fast-track your application given the circumstances. We'll have a historian come out to inspect the property within the next 2 weeks, and we should have a determination within 60 days after that." It was the first good news I'd had in months. I thanked her profusely and immediately called Susan to let her know. The historian who came to inspect the barn was a man in his 60s named Dr. Thomas Brenner, a professor emeritus from Millersville University, who specialized in Pennsylvania German architecture. He spent 3 hours examining every inch of the barn, taking measurements, photographing the timber joinery, and making notes on a thick pad of paper. "This is a remarkable structure," he told me as we stood in the barn's upper level, surrounded by the massive hand-hewn beams. "The craftsmanship is exceptional. See these mortise and tenon joints? They're perfectly fitted, no nails or metal hardware. This is authentic Pennsylvania German timber frame construction. And the fact that so much of the original structure is intact is quite rare. Most of these barns have been heavily modified or demolished over the years. So you think it qualifies for the registry? I can't make the final determination, but I'll be writing a very favorable report. The architectural significance alone would be enough, but combined with the historical documentation you provided about the Weber family and the barn's role in the German immigrant community, I'd say you have an excellent case." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Dr. Brenner spent another hour measuring and photographing, then thanked me and said his report would be submitted within a week. The injunction hearing arrived on a hot July morning. The courtroom was in the Lancaster County Courthouse, a beautiful old building with marble floors and high ceilings. Susan and I sat at one table, while Patricia and the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit named Richard Palmer, sat at another. About a dozen residents from the neighborhood were in the gallery, some who I recognized as friendly neighbors, others who seemed to be on Patricia's side. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Rachel Freeman. She had a reputation for being fair but tough, and she clearly didn't like having her time wasted. Susan presented our case first, explaining the barn's historical significance, the nomination for the state registry, and the harassment we'd been experiencing from the HOA. She showed photos of the barn, copies of the historical documentation, and Dr. Brenner's preliminary assessment. She argued that the fines were excessive, that the HOA was acting in bad faith, and that allowing them to continue could result in the destruction of a significant historical structure before the state had a chance to review it properly. Palmer, the HOA attorney, argued that none of that mattered because I had signed a contract agreeing to abide by HOA rules. He claimed the barn was a danger to the community, that it was bringing down property values, and that the HOA had every right to enforce its standards. He presented photos that Patricia had taken, zooming in on rotting boards and making the barn look as decrepit as possible. "Your Honor," Palmer said in his smooth lawyer voice, "this is not about historical preservation. This is about a homeowner who wants to ignore the rules everyone else has to follow. The barn is an eyesore and a liability. Mr. Morrison has had months to address the situation, and instead he's wasted everyone's time with this historical registry application as a delaying tactic." Judge Freeman listened to both sides, asked a few pointed questions, and then took a 15-minute recess to consider. When she came back, she looked directly at me. "Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed all the materials submitted, and I have to say I'm troubled by this case. On one hand, you did sign an agreement with the HOA, and they do have legitimate authority to maintain community standards. On the other hand, the evidence suggests this barn has genuine historical value, and the fines being assessed seem punitive rather than corrective." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Here's what I'm going to do," Judge Freeman continued. "I'm granting a temporary injunction against the fines and any lien placement for a period of 90 days. This will give the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission time to complete their review of the registry application. If the barn is accepted onto the registry, this matter is resolved in Mr. Morrison's favor, as state law will supersede the HOA agreement. If the application is denied, we'll revisit the issue and I'll make a final determination at that time. Your Honor, Palmer stood up. The HOA respectfully objects. This sets a dangerous precedent. Your objection is noted, Counselor. But this is my ruling. 90 days. Use that time wisely, all of you. She banged her gavel, and the hearing was over. Susan and I walked out of the courthouse into the bright summer sun, and I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. That went about as well as we could have hoped, Susan said. The judge basically told the HOA to back off and let the process play out. They can't fine you, they can't place a lien, and they can't seek a demolition order for at least 90 days. What happens after 90 days if the commission hasn't made a decision yet? We ask for an extension, but honestly, I think the commission will move faster now that there's a court order involved. Nobody wants to be the reason a historical building gets demolished. She was right. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the commission. The barn had been accepted onto the Pennsylvania Registry of Historical Places. The official designation would take another few weeks to process, but the determination had been made. The Weber barn, as it was now officially known, was recognized as a historically and architecturally significant structure worthy of preservation. I immediately called Susan, who drafted a letter to the HOA informing them of the decision and citing the relevant Pennsylvania statutes that protected registered historical properties from local regulations requiring demolition or substantial alteration. The letter made it clear that any further attempts to force the barn's removal would be violations of state law. I expected Patricia to back down. I was wrong again. 2 days after Susan sent the letter, I received a response from Palmer, the HOA attorney. The letter acknowledged the historical registry designation, but argued that it didn't absolve me of the responsibility to maintain the property in compliance with HOA standards. They demanded that I submit a comprehensive renovation plan that would bring the barn into aesthetic compliance with neighborhood standards while respecting its historical status. The plan needed to include new paint, roof repairs, landscaping around the barn, and regular maintenance schedules. If I didn't submit an acceptable plan within 30 days, they would resume fines for inadequate maintenance of a historical structure. They're not giving up, I told Susan over the phone. They've just shifted their argument. They're grasping at straws. Susan replied, but unfortunately, they might have a point about maintenance. The historical registry doesn't give you the right to let the barn fall apart. It protects it from demolition, but you do have an obligation to keep it in reasonable condition. I've been maintaining it. I've replaced boards, reinforced the structure, cleaned it up. What more do they want? They want to make your life difficult, Henry. But here's the good news, we can turn this around on them. Draft a renovation plan that's historically appropriate. Get it approved by the Historical Commission. Then submit it to the HOA and dare them to reject a plan that's been vetted by state historians. If they do reject it, we go back to court and argue they're interfering with historical preservation. I spent the next 2 weeks working with Dr. Brenner and a preservation specialist to develop a proper renovation plan for the barn. It included structural reinforcement of the foundation, replacement of damaged boards using historically appropriate materials and techniques, repairs to the roof using traditional slate shingles, and a modest landscaping plan that would highlight the barn's historical character. The total cost was estimated at $45,000, which was way more than I had planned to spend, but Dr. Brenner helped me apply for a state preservation grant that would cover about half the cost. I submitted the plan to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission for approval, and they signed off on it within a week. Then I submitted it to the HOA Architectural Review Board and waited. The response came from Patricia herself, not the attorney. The letter was shorter than usual and almost courteous in tone. The Architectural Review Board had approved my renovation plan with one modification. I needed to add screening vegetation along the property line to minimize the barn's visibility from neighboring properties. It was a reasonable request, and honestly, I'd been planning to plant some trees anyway. I agreed to the modification and thought that was the end of it. The HOA had finally accepted reality, and I could move forward with fixing up the barn without constant harassment. That peaceful period lasted exactly 3 weeks. On a Tuesday evening in late August, I came home from work to find a notice taped to my front door. It was from the township zoning office, informing me that a complaint had been filed regarding unpermitted commercial activity on my property. According to the complaint, I was operating a construction business out of the barn, storing commercial vehicles and equipment, and conducting business activities in violation of the residential zoning designation. None of it was true. I didn't have a construction business. I worked for a construction company, but I was a project manager who worked in an office. I didn't store commercial vehicles on my property. My personal truck was just a regular Ford F-150. And I certainly wasn't conducting any business activities from the barn. I called the zoning office the next morning and spoke to a clerk who explained that they'd received a detailed complaint with photographs showing construction equipment, vehicles coming and going at all hours, and alleged business meetings taking place on the property. The complaint had been filed anonymously, but I knew exactly who was behind it. These allegations are completely false, I told the clerk. I'm happy to have a zoning officer come out and inspect the property. You won't find any commercial activity. We'll schedule an inspection for next week, the clerk said. In the meantime, the complaint is on file, and if we find any violations, you'll be subject to fines and potential legal action. I was furious. I called Susan immediately. Patricia's not going to stop, I told her. She's filing false complaints now, trying to create problems through any channel she can find. Do you have any proof it was her? Who else would it be? The timing is too convenient right after she had to back down on the barn issue. You're probably right, but we need evidence. Here's what we're going to do. First, cooperate fully with the zoning inspection and prove the complaint is false. Second, start documenting everything, every letter, every interaction, every time someone from the HOA comes near your property. If we can establish a pattern of harassment, we can take legal action against Patricia personally, not just the HOA. The zoning inspector came out the following Tuesday. He was a middle-aged man named Frank who seemed bored by the whole thing. He walked around my property for about 20 minutes, looked in the barn, checked for commercial equipment or vehicles, and found nothing because there was nothing to find. Somebody wasted my time, Frank told me as he filled out his report. There's no commercial activity here. You've got a personal vehicle, some basic tools, and an old barn that you're obviously fixing up. Whoever filed this complaint either has bad information or is just causing trouble. Can I get a copy of the complaint? I'd like to know what specific allegations were made. I can give you a redacted version without the complainant's information. Give me a few days to process it. When I got the complaint report, it was eye-opening. The photographs showed my property, but they were taken from angles that made everything look suspicious. My truck was described as a commercial construction vehicle. A wheelbarrow and some lumber I'd bought for barn repairs were labeled as commercial construction equipment. Worst of all, there were photos of my neighbors Jerry and Mike Chen visiting one Saturday when they'd come over to help me move some heavy beams in the barn. The complaint described it as a business meeting with multiple commercial vehicles present. It was a complete fabrication, but someone had put real effort into making it look credible. I made copies of everything and added it to the growing file of documentation. Over the next month, things escalated in ways I never could have predicted. I started receiving code enforcement complaints about everything imaginable. My grass was allegedly too long, even though I mowed every week. My house numbers weren't visible enough from the street. I had an unpermitted shed that turned out to be a decorative gazebo the previous owner had built 20 years earlier. Every complaint was anonymous, every complaint was investigated, and every complaint was ultimately found to be without merit. But each one required my time and attention, and the stress was taking a serious toll. My neighbors started telling me they were being harassed too. Jerry Chen said he'd been questioned by Patricia about his friendship with me, and she'd implied that he was somehow complicit in my violations. The Hendersons next door told me that Patricia had suggested they should petition to have my property rezoned or force me to sell. Most of the neighbors were supportive, but a few seemed to buy into Patricia's narrative that I was a troublemaker bringing down property values. In mid-September, I got home from work to find that someone had spray-painted "Tear It Down" on the side of the barn in big red letters. I immediately called the police and filed a vandalism report. The officer who responded was professional and sympathetic, but he told me that without witnesses or security camera footage showing who did it, there wasn't much they could do. You might want to install cameras if you don't have them already, the officer suggested. Property disputes like this sometimes escalate, and it's good to have evidence. I already had cameras, but they were focused on the house and didn't cover the barn. The next day I installed additional cameras that covered the barn from multiple angles, and I added motion sensor lights around the entire structure. I also filed a report with the HOA about the vandalism, noting that it seemed targeted and asking if they had any information about who might be responsible. Patricia's response was infuriating. She expressed concern about the vandalism but suggested that perhaps I had enemies due to my confrontational approach to community relations. She also noted that the graffiti, while unfortunate, was now a violation of HOA appearance standards and needed to be removed within 7 days or I would face fines. I cleaned the graffiti off the barn the same weekend, using a special solvent that wouldn't damage the old wood. It took me 6 hours and cost $200 in supplies, but I wasn't going to give Patricia any excuse to come after me. The breaking point came in early October. I was at work when I got a call from Jerry Chen. "Henry, you need to get home right now," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "There are people at your property. They have equipment." "What kind of equipment?" "A bulldozer and some kind of crane truck. They're setting up in your driveway." My blood went cold. "Call the police, I'm on my way." I told my boss I had an emergency and drove home going 20 miles over the speed limit, my heart pounding the entire way. When I pulled onto my street, I saw exactly what Jerry had described: a bulldozer and a crane truck parked in my driveway, along with a white pickup truck with a construction company logo on the side. 3 men in hard hats and work clothes were standing near the barn, looking at clipboards and pointing at the structure. I parked my truck sideways across the driveway, blocking any exit, and jumped out. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" I shouted, running toward them. One of the men, a stocky guy with a gray beard, held up his hands. "Whoa, calm down. We're from Strickland Demolition. We have a work order to remove this barn." "Who gave you that work order?" He pulled out a sheet of paper and showed me. It was on official-looking letterhead from Meadowbrook Estates Property Management and was signed by Patricia Whitmore. It authorized Strickland Demolition to remove non-compliant structure at 847 Oak Ridge Road as per HOA board directive and county court order. "There is no court order," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "This is my property, and I did not authorize this. If you start demolishing my barn, you'll be arrested for destruction of property." The contractor looked uncomfortable. "Look, man, I'm just doing the job I was hired for. If there's a dispute, you need to take it up with whoever hired us. We have a signed work order and a check from the HOA. The HOA doesn't own this property and has no authority to demolish anything. That barn is a registered historical landmark protected by state law. If you so much as touch it, you're committing a crime." That got his attention. "Historical landmark? Nobody said anything about that. Because the person who hired you is lying. I'm calling the police right now, and I'm calling my lawyer. If you're still here in 5 minutes, you're going to be part of a lawsuit." I pulled out my phone and called 911, reporting trespassing and attempted destruction of property. The operator told me a unit was on the way. Then I called Susan and explained what was happening. "Do not let them touch that barn," Susan said. "I'm calling the HOA attorney right now and Patricia's personal phone. This is beyond anything they have the right to do. Just keep those workers away from the barn until the police arrive." The demolition crew didn't wait for the police. The contractor made a quick phone call, talked to someone for a minute, then hung up and told his crew to pack it up. "We're leaving," he told me. "I'm not getting in the middle of whatever this is. You'll need to sort it out with Meadowbrook Estates." They loaded their equipment and drove away just as a police cruiser pulled up. The officer who got out was the same one who'd taken the vandalism report a few weeks earlier. I explained the situation, showed him the fraudulent work order, and gave him copies of the historical registry designation and the judge's previous ruling. "This is way beyond a simple HOA dispute," the officer said, making notes. "If someone falsified a court order, that's a serious crime, and attempting to demolish a historical landmark without authorization could be criminal mischief or worse. I'm going to need to file a full report and probably refer this to detectives." Susan arrived about 20 minutes later along with Palmer, the HOA attorney. Palmer looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. My client had no knowledge of this action. Palmer said immediately, which I knew was a lie, "It appears there was a miscommunication within the HOA board about proper procedures." "A miscommunication?" Susan's voice was icy. Your client created a fraudulent work order claiming a court authorization that doesn't exist, hired contractors to demolish a protected historical structure, and trespassed on private property with heavy equipment. That's not miscommunication, that's criminal. The police officer looked at Palmer. I'm going to need to speak with Patricia Whitmore. Do you know where I can reach her? I'll have her contact you, Palmer said quickly. But I want to be clear that the HOA as an organization did not authorize this specific action today. Then who did? I demanded. Palmer didn't answer. He got in his car and left. Over the next few days, the situation exploded. The police investigation revealed that Patricia had indeed created the work order herself, without approval from the rest of the HOA board. She'd used HOA funds to pay for the demolition and had forged a reference to a court order that didn't exist. When the other board members found out, there was an emergency meeting, and Patricia was voted out as president. Robert Chen, the board member who'd looked uncomfortable during that first meeting months ago, was elected as the new president. Robert called me personally to apologize. Henry, I am so sorry. Most of us on the board had no idea Patricia was doing these things. We knew there was a dispute about the barn, but we thought it was being handled through proper legal channels. What she did was completely unacceptable, and the board is taking steps to make this right. What kind of steps? We're terminating the HOA's legal action against you entirely. We're refunding all the fines you paid, plus interest, and we're updating our bylaws to include explicit protections for historical structures. This should never have happened. It was the apology I'd been waiting months to hear, but the damage had been done. Patricia had crossed a line from petty harassment into actual criminal behavior. The district attorney's office took the case seriously. Patricia was charged with forgery, criminal trespass, attempted criminal mischief, and theft of HOA funds. The case made local news, and suddenly my quiet property dispute was a public scandal. Reporters called asking for interviews. Neighbors I'd never met stopped by to offer support. The whole thing was surreal. Patricia's trial was scheduled for January. In the meantime, I focused on the barn renovation. With the HOA drama finally resolved and a preservation grant covering half the costs, I was able to hire skilled craftsmen who specialized in historical restoration. The work took 3 months, but when it was finished, the barn looked better than it had in decades. The structure was sound. The roof was repaired with traditional slate, and the weathered wood had been carefully restored to highlight its character while ensuring its stability. Dr. Brenner came back to see the finished restoration and was thrilled. This is exactly how these projects should be done, he told me, walking through the barn and examining the work. You've preserved the historical integrity while ensuring the structure will last another century. The barn became a minor local celebrity. The Historical Society asked if they could include it in their annual heritage tour. A magazine called Pennsylvania Heritage did a feature story on the restoration and the legal battle that had saved it. School groups started asking if they could visit to learn about Pennsylvania German architecture and local history. Patricia's trial was quick and decisive. She pleaded no contest to reduce charges in exchange for a sentence of 2 years probation, community service, and full restitution to the HOA and to me personally for the costs I'd incurred defending against her harassment. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board. I attended the sentencing hearing, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to see the end of it. Patricia looked smaller somehow, defeated. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she stood and gave a brief statement. I let my responsibilities as HOA president become an obsession, she said, her voice quiet. I convinced myself that I was protecting the community, but I was really just trying to control something because I felt powerless in other areas of my life. I'm sorry for what I did to Mr. Morrison and to the other members of the HOA who trusted me. I hope someday I can make amends. It wasn't much, but it was something. I didn't forgive her. What she'd done had caused me months of stress, cost me thousands of dollars, and nearly destroyed a piece of history. But I understood that she was a person who'd lost her way. After the hearing, Robert Chen and I went to get coffee. The new HOA board had worked hard to rebuild trust in the community, and Robert had been instrumental in that effort. How's the barn coming along? He asked. Finished last month. It looks incredible. You should come by and see it. I'd like that. And Henry, I want you to know that we've been working on something. The board voted unanimously to establish the Meadowbrook Historical Preservation Committee. We want to identify other historical structures in the neighborhood and protect them, Make sure what happened with your barn never happens to anyone else. That's a great idea. I'd be happy to help. Actually, we were hoping you'd chair the committee. You've certainly earned the expertise. I laughed. I don't know about expertise, but I've definitely learned more than I ever wanted to know about historical preservation and HOA law. So is that a yes? I thought about it for a moment. 6 months ago, I would have said no, would have wanted nothing to do with the HOA ever again. But things had changed. The people who'd made my life miserable were gone, replaced by reasonable neighbors who genuinely wanted to make the community better. Yeah, I said finally. I'll do it. 2 years later, the Weber barn stands proud on my property, fully restored and protected not just by state law, but by a community that has learned to value its history. The Meadowbrook Historical Preservation Committee has identified and protected 4 other historical structures in the neighborhood, including an old springhouse and a stone wall that dates back to the 1700s. Property values have actually increased, not because we tore down the old buildings, but because we preserved them and made them part of the community's identity. I still think about that day when Patricia showed up at my door with the first letter demanding I tear down the barn. If I'd given in, if I'd accepted their demands without fighting back, a piece of Pennsylvania history would be gone forever. The barn that Johann Weber built in 1873, where German immigrants gathered and built their community, where children learned during a harsh winter, would have been reduced to a pile of rubble to satisfy one person's need for control. Instead, it stands as a reminder that history matters, that we have a responsibility to preserve what came before us, and that sometimes the fight to protect what's right is worth every difficult moment. The barn isn't just a building anymore. It's a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny, a testament to the importance of historical preservation, and a gathering place for a community that learned to value character over conformity. Every evening when I get home from work, I park my truck and walk over to the barn. I run my hand along the old wood, feeling the marks left by craftsmen who've been dead for a century and a half. And I'm grateful that I fought back, grateful for the neighbors who supported me, grateful for the laws that protected this piece of history, and grateful that future generations will be able to stand in this barn and connect with the past. The HOA tried to demolish my old barn. The state said it was a registered historical landmark, and in the end, history won.